Well, good afternoon. It's 3 p.m. and we are ready to start the session on corporate finance called Green Financing and ESG. And we'll just turn to the first paper, Outsourcing Climate Change, presented by Liang from Singapore Management University. Liang, you have 25 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Casper. And let me start sharing. I hope everybody can see this. So thanks to the organizer for including my paper into the program, and also thanks everybody for being here. This is still a preliminary work. I look forward to the discussion later on. This is a joint work with Rui Dai, Rui Duan, and also Lilian. Unfortunately, none of them can be here at this timing, so I will just do my presentation and take all the questions on myself. So this is a paper about climate change, which is probably one of the hottest topics nowadays. And this is a graph that I use for another research of mine, showing basically the carbon emissions, which I believe to be the main driving force of climate change, man-made driving force of climate change globally. And as you can see, the blue color represent emissions, carbon emissions by developed economies, US, EU, and Japan, and others, whereas the orange colors represent emissions by emerging economies, China, India, Russia, Brazil, and others. So from the trends, what we can observe is developed economies, they emit, their emission level on average remains stable over the past few decades. There is a trend of declining, whereas the emission by emerging economies are rapidly increasing. So if we take this figure at the face value, we seem to be able to conclude that developed economies are doing well, whereas the key contributor of climate change are the emerging economies. But of course, as researchers, we don't take results at the face value. So this paper goes deeper into whether that's indeed the case. And before I go deeper, I also want to highlight that around the globe, there are a lot of efforts put into place to reduce this trend. For example, in 2015, December, there was a Paris climate change agreement. The global leaders around the world, they went to Paris to reach the agreement that they will hold the increase in the global average temperature to be well below 2 Celsius degree above the pre-industrial level. And this was drafted by Brazil, Africa, India, China, and South Africa, and also the United States. And then the next year in Hangzhou, during the G20 summit, global leaders further ratify what they agreed on in Paris. But we also know that it was not always progressing. And shortly after that, Trump was elected to be the president of the US and announced that US would withdraw from the Paris Agreement. And then after Trump, more recently, Biden was elected. And just a few hours after he officially became the US president, Biden announced that US will rejoin Paris Agreement. So this is, a really high level discussion about, whether countries around the world should, work together to reduce the impacts on climate change. And also investors care about it. This is from a paper by Philip. I saw Philip is also in the audience. RFS paper last year, in which they sent out survey to institutional investors around the world. One of the major questions was, which approach have you taken to incorporate climate risk management in your investment process? And the number one answer was to analyze carbon footprint of their portfolio companies. Okay, so we see a lot of efforts by governments, by investors. How about corporations? Beyond government efforts, which usually take place through laws, regulations, and taxation, corporations play an important role and proactive role in reducing carbon emission or greenhouse gas emission. For example, Microsoft has been carbon neutral since 2012, Amazon is targeting a net zero carbon footprint by 2040. And there is also an alliance of corporations committing to achieve 100% renewable electricity. This is so-called RE100. It's also for companies around the world. In many countries and states, regulations are becoming very strong in curbing corporate emissions, such as the California Cap and Trade Program. But we also observe that some companies, especially financially constrained companies, under such strong regulatory force, they may shift their emissions and plans to less regulated countries or states to evade this regulatory cost. Bertrand, Ho, and King recently has a JFE paper nicely documenting this pattern. So much of the attention in the literature is paid to a firm's direct emission and the so-called Scope 1 emission, as well as the energy consumption in order to make the product, make the goods, and the so-called Scope 2 emission. However, there's a big part of emission, which is indirect emission that are generated by a firm's suppliers along the supply chain, the so-called Scope 3 emission, which is often ignored, despite this being a substantial part of a company's total emission. So let me briefly illustrate what are Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. So as I mentioned earlier, Scope 1 emissions are the emissions that are generated from the firm's own production process. But during the production process, you may also consume electricity, consume other energy, which will also lead to emissions, and this is called Scope 2 emission. And then there will be emissions on your value chain or your supply chain. So these are Scope 3 emissions. Scope 3 emissions can also be upstream, that means from your suppliers, or can be downstream, that means from your customers who buy your products. Okay, so let me give you a few examples. For example, P&G is one of the major consumer goods manufacturers in the world. They have a very ambitious climate commitment, namely they want to reduce their annual emission by half by 2030. And when P&G made this commitment, they were mostly talking about their own kind of a Scope 1 or Scope 2 emission. So that's mostly about this part. But if you look at the whole value chain, in order to make those products, P&G need to outsource a lot of raw materials from its suppliers and actually several layers of the suppliers. If you take into account of the emissions by those suppliers and you look at the pie that I'm showing you on the right, the Scope 1, Scope 2 emission of P&G only accounts for a very small part, whereas the big part of the emission actually comes from its suppliers. So when P&G makes this very ambitious climate commitment, they were mostly talking about less than 5% of the total emission on its own value chain. So this is P&G. How about countries? This is an article from New York Times talking about British emissions at the country level. So if you think about emissions by British firms over time, you do see a downward trend, namely you don't consider imports from overseas suppliers. British firms, they do emit less and less. But then when you take into account of the emissions by overseas suppliers, namely by taking into account of imports, actually there's not a downward trend. There is actually an upward trend in some years. So even at the aggregates, I think it's not clear that globally speaking, we are actually achieving the targets of carbon neutrality. Probably we are emitting more and more, especially when you think about where are the suppliers. So the research questions motivated by these observations are the following. First, we try to answer whether firms curb their own domestic emissions. Here, domestic refers to US. This is a US study, by outsourcing their carbon pollutions to their suppliers overseas, outside the US, which will result in a carbon leakage. Second, if there is indeed a carbon leakage, that means although firms, they emit less, but actually their suppliers overseas emit much more, then what are the mechanisms that drive such an emission outsourcing to their overseas suppliers? Third, from the finance perspective, are investors aware of such emission outsourcing and the potential risk and probably price in such risk? In order to answer these questions, we resort to several data sets. Some of them are newly available. So the first data set that we look at is S&P Global's True Cost. True Cost used to be a ESG database, but 2 years ago was acquired by S&P that collects company environmental data, including performance data and disclosure metrics on greenhouse gas emissions, water waste, pollution impact, and waste disposal. Of course, for our purpose, we mostly focus on the greenhouse gas emission. The source for this information comes from a variety of publicly disclosed documents, such as financial reports, environmental data sources, and data published on their websites. Another important data source is also from S&P Global, that's called Panjiva. So Panjiva basically gave us the information about a firm's international supply chain in terms of the import and export details on commercial shipments around the world. And especially it provides ocean freight shipment data for imports and exports from the US, including consumer specifications, EU weight in kilograms and metric tons. We also combine these two major data sources with other data. For example, we look at Refinitiv ESG data, which gives ESG ratings at the firm level. We look at firms' ESG reputational risk from the data set called Rep Risk, which is also at the firm level. And we have many other data sources related to state level regulatory forces, related to nature disasters, related to countries' environmental regulation, economic development, firm level director profiles, ownership, supply chain, and financials. Okay, so this is kind of an overview of our whole data sets. So many of you, given this is a session about ESG green financing, you probably are already aware of the true cost data. I want to show you a little bit more details of the Panjiva data about shipments. So for example, here I'm showing you early this year, Tesla, the US company, actually have their overseas suppliers providing them raw materials from China, from Spain, and from Mexico. So from Panjiva data, you actually know what's the volume in terms of TUE, what's the weight of the shipments, and what's the estimated value of goods in the shipment, and what kind of products in the shipment in terms of HS code. So you can think about HS code as an industry code. So for example, for the shipment from Shenzhen that contains goods which span 2 industries, whereas for the shipment from Spain and Mexico, they mostly from 1 single industry. So what is our regression method? So the regression that we were running is basically on the left-hand side. We look at a firm's scope 3 emission, and on the right-hand side we look at the firm's scope 1 emission. So again, scope 1 means the firm's own emission from its own operations, whereas scope 3 are the emissions from its suppliers and customers. One thing I want to emphasize is that the data we got actually look at the upstream suppliers. So we are not talking about customers. And also scope 3 includes both domestic suppliers and overseas suppliers. In order to tease out this overseas suppliers part, because outsourcing refers to outsourcing to overseas suppliers, we interact scope 1 with this variable called import, which is measured by the number of shipments. So this variable basically tells us, how much is outsourced from overseas suppliers. We also control for our typical firm level financial variables and a bunch of fixed effects, including firm fixed effect, country fixed effect, and year fixed effect, or country times year fixed effects. What do we expect to find? So first, following a paper that I had earlier with Rui Dai and Lilian, That was a JFE paper last year. We expect this coefficient, the coefficient on the main effect of scope 1 to be positive, because in the earlier paper, we find that customers and suppliers' CSR activities, they are highly correlated with each other. They move in the same direction. So carbon emission or reduction in carbon emission are also one type of CSR activities. So we also expect them to move in the same direction. But how about the emission by overseas suppliers, not suppliers in general, so which is captured by this beta SI? We would expect this to be negative. So that means the positive CSR link between customer and supplier will be attenuated the more the firm outsource from overseas suppliers. So what do we find? We ran first 4 regressions. The first 2, the dependent variable is scope 3, and the next 2, the dependent variable is scope 2 plus 3. So if you want to consider 2 plus 3 as all the indirect emissions, not from the firm's own operations. So we first find that indeed scope 1 and scope 3, they are positively correlated with each other. So 1 standard deviation increase in scope 1 leads to almost 5% increase in scope 3, or more than 6% increase in scope 2 plus 3. But our key variable of interest is this interaction term, right? So that is the emission, the sensitivity of emission from overseas suppliers. We find the coefficient of this interaction term is constantly negative, and once standard deviation increase in import from the mean attenuates the positive scope 1, scope 3 link by more than 2%. So we differentiate depending on our fixed effects combination, but the results are pretty consistent. We also try to do a little bit on the identification part because one may be concerned that U.S. firms may choose countries of import for other production cost considerations rather than to evade their emission responsibilities. So our main identification test basically explored the demand shocks on the incentive for U.S. firms to outsource carbon emissions. We focus on 2 aspects. One is domestic legislative pressure. The other is a regulatory stringency. So in order to measure legislative pressure, we calculate the average voting score across Congress members on environmental legislation bills for Senate and for House of Representatives separately in each state. And then we identify shock at the state years which experience score increase by more than 3 times, or in other words, 4 times. So for whatever reason, if suddenly people vote a lot on those environmental legislation bills, because there is as a shock to the companies in the state who may have a stronger incentive to outsource. Similarly, we also use similar approach for regulatory stringency by identifying facility level inspection intensity by Environmental Protection Agency, so EPA, which increased by more than 3 times than the average increase during the sample period. So EPA is an environmental regulatory authority. They usually randomly set people to inspect facilities. And if we suddenly see they send a lot of people to particular facilities, we consider this as the shock to the firms that own those facilities. Because our key variable of interest is already an interaction term, so including the shock, we estimate basically a triple interaction regression. And this is what we find. So again, if you look at scope 1 times import, they are mostly negative. And this negative effect is even stronger when we further interact with this treatment. Either it's legislative bills or it's on-site inspection by EPAs. So we find the outsourcing effect to be stronger when the pressure from regulators are getting higher. So we conduct a lot of other robustness tests or tests which try to help us to tease out potential mechanisms. I don't have time to show all of them. So what I'm going to show is one slide with all the bullet points of what we do. We find the outsourcing effects become stronger for suppliers. from emerging economies and I missed a word here, non-OECD economies. So this is easy to understand. US firms, they try to exploit the lesser regulations in emerging economies. And we also find that, I think I messed up this. So there should be a non-OECD and there should be less. So we also find that these effects are stronger for suppliers from countries with less stringent environmental regulations, and also for suppliers from common law countries. US itself is a common law country, and in another paper of mine, we document that common law compared to civil law countries focus more on shareholders rather than stakeholders. So, if you focus less on stakeholders compared to shareholders, you may be waiting to outsource more from those countries. And finally, we found that these effects are stronger for suppliers from countries with, on average, greater emission intensities. We also try to explore potential mechanisms. For example, we found the effects are stronger for firms with higher environmental ratings from Refinitiv ESG. Those are considered as green firms. They got higher ratings, so they have a stronger incentive to maintain their environmental reputation, and so they are more willing to outsource their emission. It's also stronger for firms with CEOs have more past employment experience in high ESG companies. We define those as green CEOs who also care more about their reputations, and also for average directors having more past employment experience in high ESG companies. We define them as green directors who are also concerned about their reputations. The effects become weaker for firms. I think I totally messed up these slides. They should be weaker for firms with government customers, and for firms with more green corporate customers, and for firms with more ownership by green institutional investors. So the idea is the following. Usually the government or corporate customers and the institutional investors, they are more concerned about externality issues. And with customers, they are usually in different countries, and the institutional investors, such as BlackRock, their portfolio are also global in nature. So those kind of investors, they would care about carbon emission on the global scale, so they will push back, this emission outsourcing from the US firms. So we indeed find evidence supporting this. And finally, we try to gauge what are the economic consequences by asking the following questions. Do firms that emit less or more that will have lower or higher systematic risk with regard to their reputation, which we call it rep risk? Do investors price in such climate risk by suppliers or the hidden emission risk? Do outsourcing firms have more green innovations as a substitute? So although they outsource emission to the suppliers, but they may have more green innovations. And we create some measures that help us to test these questions called Scope 1 CO2, Scope 2 CO2, Scope 3 CO2, and imported CO2 based on the information we get from Panjiva. So earlier, our key variables are based on the number of shipments, but now with the Panjiva's detailed industry classification, we can actually estimate roughly how much CO2 is contained in each shipment. So first, we test on reputational risk by running this regression. Dependent variable is the rep risk score, and independent variables are imported CO2 together with Scope 1, 2, 3 CO2s. We find that most of the effects show up in imported CO2. In other words, that's the outsourced part of climate change, whereas the emission by the firm's own operations, electricity use, and domestic suppliers are not strongly related to its systematic reputational risk. When we regress the firm's stock return on these variables, we find that when we regress them individually, then all of them have predictive power. But when we run a house race in column 5, only the Scope 3, so that's the overall suppliers, and the imported CO2, that's the outsourced part, they have a strong predictive power. So that means investors have priced in the climate risk related to the firm's own emission or energy consumption, but they haven't fully priced in the outsourced part, especially the imported CO2 part. So this is the part that have further predictability on stock returns. Finally, so this is just a remark that investors do not seem to fully price in outsourced carbon risk. Finally, are these firms good firms or bad firms? So if they outsource more, do they have more green innovation? So we look at their patenting information, and we look at the patents that are related to environmental issues. We find that those are the firms that actually have a lower level of green innovation. So in other words, those are the bad guys. On one hand, they outsource more of emissions. On the other hand, they have less innovation rather than more innovation. Okay, so they really try to shirk their climate responsibility. All right, let me conclude. So despite significant efforts around the world in reducing greenhouse gas emission, we find that corporations have a strong incentive to evade this responsibility, which create a so-called whack-a-mole game. So if you want to price them in the US, they will have more emissions coming out elsewhere. We found strong evidence that US firms reduce their carbon footprint through outsourcing pollutions overseas. And such emission outsourcing is not fully priced in by investors. Also, firms that outsource more are also those with less green innovations. So a key message we try to convey in this paper is that it's important to count carbon footprints along the whole supply chain. And we also want to have a policy recommendation that, many investors nowadays are talking about divesting polluting firms, and we think this is not the right policy prescription. Although BlackRock can divest certain firms, but for sure someone else will pick up those firms. So this may induce more pollutions elsewhere. The bottom line is climate change is a global issue, and there is a quest for international corporations to achieve the global carbon neutrality. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion by Lakshmi.
Thanks, Liang. The discussant is Lakshmi Naaraayanan from London Business School.
I hope you can see my screen and hear me well. Okay, fantastic. So thank you so much, Casper, for asking me to discuss this paper, and thank you, Hao, for sending me the paper well in advance. It was quite a pleasure to read, quite voluminous, as you could see from Hao's presentation, thought through in general. So it was quite interesting because this was on my reading list anyway. So let me kind of summarize what the paper does. So my reading of the paper is following that firm level imports tend to moderate a relationship between firms' direct emissions, which are scope 1 emissions, and its scope 2 plus 3 or scope 3 emissions, which are indirect emissions, which take place outside the boundaries of the firm with the suppliers and customers of the firm. So there is a key role of thinking about imports, moderating this relationship in general. The authors do a very thorough analysis in trying to establish that this relationship kind of is moderated by imports, and they use 3 specific exogenous shocks to think about this relationship. And they argue all these 3 different shocks lead to an increase in demand for carbon, for outsourcing carbon emissions. So they focus on domestic legislative pressure, which through the average votes that a congressional vote at a particular Senate or in a House of Representatives kind of puts pressure on firms to think more about environment and emissions in general. They also look at EPA's facility level inspections. Then, as a second experiment, they also use large import tariff reductions as, again, a shock to increase demand for making such changes. And lastly, they also kind of think about this from the perspective of the natural disasters that happen in the supplier's origin country. And across these 3 additional set of analysis, they consistently find that when there is, or they interpret these evidence consistent that whenever there is an increased demand for moving your pollution moving your pollution to your supplier, you do see this relationship to be moderated. Then subsequently, once they've kind of established this, they then kind of think about what are the country characteristics and what kind of countries do firms choose to export such pollution. And here, as Hao mentioned, they rely on OECD versus non-OECD countries as one of the cuts. And the argument here being that there should be substantial difference between developed and developing countries in general. They also kind of look at stringency and enforcement through variation in common law and civil law. And then they also use the Environmental Protection Index, which classifies each country based on their stringency towards environmental law. Then the paper then kind of talks about mechanisms, and they kind of broadly think about mechanisms through which this happens as internal mechanisms and external mechanisms. And here the idea being that internally some firms might be more motivated or better motivated to affect change, and this could be reflected either in the form of a higher rating, which they call as a green firm, or it could be driven by directors or CEOs who have such values, and which they term as green CEOs and green directors. In terms of external mechanisms, they also argue and rely heavily on some of their previous work, where they argue that it's not just the interaction of the firm with its shareholders, but also with other stakeholders. And here they think about the role of government customers, green corporate customers, and institutional block holders, who've been shown in previous work are more likely to police the firms and their emissions in general. And subsequently, the last part of the paper, they also kind of shed potential and interesting insights about the economic consequences of imported emissions. And they argue that much of this relies on the fact that firms have quite a significant amount of reputational risk. And this would definitely affect future returns going forward. And they try to understand if this is a substitute for green innovation in general. So overall, I think the paper is quite ambitious and tries to do a lot and puts together quite a fantastic set of data together. So my first impressions is, as Hao also kind of pointed out and has been working for quite some time, this is an important and timely question, and they bring to bear a good amount of data, and they conduct a fairly compelling empirical exercise. So I have to commend the authors in putting so much effort into collecting the data and kind of piecing together these results, and they've done, as you can see from my discussion and also Hao's presentation, they've kind of thought through many of the holes and have been very rigorous in thinking about each of the issues that kind of come about. So in my discussion, I'm kind of wanting to focus on three things, and I'm going to kind of spend some time thinking about what is it that we're measuring in the context of the question that the authors are asking, and what this measurement means, and how can we kind of improve upon it. The second is going to kind of take the results that we know from the paper and kind of interpret as to, can these be best explained by other alternative stories, and perhaps also thinking about what mechanisms are driving these stories, which I think will add more punch to the paper. And in the last, if I have some time, I'll have some minor quibbles, which the authors can feel free to ignore in general. So let me kind of dive straight into it. So what does the paper aim to do? And this is taken from the paper itself, is that the paper kind of poses this question that we want to think about how a firm tackles climate change by examining both direct and indirect carbon emissions, and also jointly with its import. Right? So the fundamental question is thinking about if direct and indirect carbon emissions are substitutes or complements, and how does that vary with imports? Now, if this is the question that we have in mind, so the authors kind of use this data on scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions that is provided by the data vendor Truecost. And if that's the question that the authors have in mind, then I think a straightforward empirical analysis would kind of think about analyzing directly changes in emissions as a function of import shock. So the idea being that the firms get an import shock, and then you would want to see at the same firm what happens to their scope 1 emissions and their scope 2 emission. Right? And I think somewhere while I was reading the paper, somewhere in the back of the mind, the authors have this idea that the emissions, there should be a further layer of distinction between domestic and foreign emissions. Right? So much of the analysis is conducted with intensive margin. So the exact the exact empirical specification that corresponds to the question that the authors have in mind should be that when there is an import shock that affects a firm, what happens to the domestic emissions versus what happens to the foreign emissions, and how that elasticity kind of changes for scope 1 and scope 3. And further, in scope 3, it would also be important to kind of delineate, if possible, whether in the scope 3 level, is it coming from upstream versus downstream, because the authors use a direct measure of imports, which suggests that the effect should only materialize through upstream and not through downstream. So when I was kind of thinking about this research question, as the authors posed, it first came to my mind that perhaps this would be the most obvious way to kind of test the predictions in the model. Right now, the authors have kind of matched it to the shipment data, and then they have a panel of firm, country, year, and then they kind of show that the relationship is moderated, and that kind of starts becoming a bit more complicated in terms of interpretation as you start having triple interactions and quadruple interactions in general. So I think having an empirical strategy that's more simplified might also ease the interpretation and might allow the authors to say a lot more in general. The second part is focusing more on thinking about emissions, as I personally had not heard about the true cost data until I read the paper. So thinking more about what exactly is true cost doing and what are these specific emissions. So here you see there is a plot in the paper. I think this is figure 1, if I'm not mistaken, where the authors plot that there is an increase as firm size goes up. You see that the orange line, which is the total of scope 2 plus 3 emission, kind of goes up, and then there is a dip in 2015, and then there is a stark rise in 2016, which kind of goes until 2017, whereas you don't see any such changes in scope 1 emissions. And authors kind of point that perhaps some of this, because it coincides with 2015, might relate to the Paris Climate Agreement and might be interesting potentially to think about. So because I did not know much about the data, I kind of looked at what prior work has done and have they kind of clarified more on what they do. So I found this paper, a recent paper rather, by Aswani, Raghunandan, and Rajgopal, which used the true cost data. And essentially what they show is that people who are working with this data have to be more careful when they're using these emissions, fundamentally because there was a substantial change in the coverage by a true cost that jumps exactly between 2015 and 2016. Right? So you see that the amount of coverage kind of triples between 2015 and 2016, and then it keeps up to the level. So on average, around 2015, you had about 750 distinct firms, whereas that jumps to about 2,300 on average after that period. So I think one has to think about if this is going to fundamentally reflect what I have put up on the left-hand side figure. One easy fix is to just focus on firms that either consistently reported or just keep the set of firms that that true costs covered before 2015 to avoid this issue. And then the other paper a bit deeper, it also fundamentally showed that why is this jump important is because after 2015, given the rise in the number of firms that the vendor covered, they started estimating the emissions data rather than kind of reporting the disclosed data. And so this is again a plot from their paper. On the left-hand side, you see the kernel density plot for log of scope 1 emissions. Blue lines are for the disclosed emissions, whereas red lines are for estimated. So you see that if one were to use the estimated data in terms of the emissions, you would see that scope 1 would be overestimated relative to the actual disclosure. Whereas if you look on the right-hand side, which is the log scope 3 emissions, that would be underestimated. Right? So now we can start to see that maybe some of this relationship could be driven by some of these estimations that the vendor does, and can then potentially feed back into some of the results which how was showing. Again, the simple fix could just be just taking those firms where firms actually disclose rather than using the estimated values. Okay? More on kind of expansion, the more I kind of read in the data, it again kind of seems that the model that they use to estimate is reliant on the supply chain network and the import-export of goods. So that, again, given that the estimated model of the vendor itself might be a function of the imports, it begs to suggest that it might be better not to use the estimated kind of model. So the first kind of thought that came in once I delved deeper was how much of this coverage expansion actually reflects the increase or the changes in how these estimations happen. And that precisely, match up with the direction of the relationship, that one might think about, rather than firms' actual disclosure. And I think the easiest fix would be just to focus on firms' disclosure itself. If not, you can just focus on the set of firms, that reported prior to 2015. So that's kind of the first comment that I had, was thinking more about what should be the empirical specification and what are we measuring, and can we kind of narrow down and focus on only firms' disclosure of their emissions. Second comment is about thinking through the results, assuming all the results hold, is how do we think about these results in that are firms actively managing their emissions and outsourcing? And by that, I mean, is it the case that firms are first order thinking about managing emissions and their production decisions, or this is a joint decision that the firms make, thinking about productions and emissions? Or one could argue that maybe changes in emissions that we observe is just a byproduct of other changes at firms, and it may or may not happen otherwise when we are thinking about such thought experiments. Okay? So, and the reason I say this is because I can imagine multiple ways in which firms can tackle climate change, and more often than not, these are non-exclusive ways, both in the short run and in the long run. Right? So thinking about firms tackling climate change, it could be that firms decide to change their production processes and decide to perhaps install scrubbers to efficiently deal with issues of pollution domestically, whereas for foreign they might require them to have more disclosures. Right? So this could also result in the fact that at the same time you see both of these changes which go in the opposite direction. Right? The other candidate is, there are some industry level demand shocks, and that would then force there to be changes in the production capacity and intensity, and hence as a byproduct of those byproduct of those demand shocks, you observe changes in emission. Right? And lastly, it could also be driven by say investor activism by pension funds or hedge funds. Some of my work and house work kind of sheds light on the role of investor activism in explaining changes in emissions. Right? So the fundamental question this brings me back to is, in this setting, given the results of what they are, how should we think about the trade-off that firms are making as the first step in terms of their emissions versus production decision? And then the next step is to think about this relationship between direct and indirect emissions. And while we're thinking about this, it would be then also worthwhile exercise to kind of shed light on what are some of the assumptions that are needed for this costless changes in direct and indirect emissions. Right? So it's not very obvious to me that the first order way to kind of affect climate change is fundamentally going to push emissions on the balance sheet of your customers or of your suppliers until and unless there is some relationship specific investment. Why should they be taking your burden? Right? So one has to kind of think about how easy it is to move between direct and indirect emissions. What are the costs? What are the complementarities and such like? So maybe one potential way of addressing this could be that the team can examine what do the firms disclose and on what executives say about targets for carbon neutrality, right? So how much are firms thinking about their customers and suppliers when they are setting these targets? And that's going to be important because that's one of the key arguments that the paper is relying on. So any evidence that kind of furthers that firms are actively thinking about their customers and suppliers while setting these targets might be informative and might bolster the argument that they have. And also, as an aside, you may want to specifically focus on how much of the firms talk about scope 3 disclosures relative to scope 1 and 2. The second comment is more about thinking about some of those experiments that Hao had mentioned, where they use congressional level voting patterns, right? And they kind of assume that this is an increased demand for imported emissions. But on the other hand, there is some research and more recent which suggests that both support and opposition for environmental legislation may itself be an outcome of bargaining, which itself is influenced by firms. So what gets put on the ballot is determined by political campaigning, lobbying, influencing, etc. And conditional on that, senators have the additional incentive to vote in a particular direction depending on which firm benefits. And this is compounded by the fact that there are other regulations which are a combination of state and federal level regulations which are implemented at the county level. So my suggestion is why not just use as a measure of stringency the actual laws that firms are kind of subjected to. The second thing is when the authors are constructing this list, it was not quite clear to me whether these are. It seems like these are based on the firm headquarter location. But we know that many of the firms here are likely to be multi-establishment firms. So maybe a robustness would go a long way to show that these results are robust to adjusting for some of these metrics. The other interpretation in terms of import tariff reduction is one can also think about these import tariff reductions as shocks to firms' competitive environment. And if these are shocks to competitive environment, then those also as a mechanism create incentives to actually cut costs. And lastly, I think thinking about having these mechanisms, and I think pinning down on the mechanisms and the incentives of why firms are doing this, I think will allow the paper, which already does a good job of making us think about scope 1 versus scope 3 emissions, relating more on the literature and highlighting which parts are more novel and kind of potentially why. I think I'm running out of time, and I'll just kind of scribble and share the slides with the author. I think this is an interesting and important paper. It's kind of very important to understand what steps firms take, both local and foreign, in terms of its climate change technology and its concomitant implications for climate change. And I think here the authors can do more in terms of thinking about what mechanisms are driving them, and that I think fundamentally allows them to relate more to the existing literature and highlight more potentially the many novel aspects that the paper has. And I think it would be interesting to kind of think about measurement challenges in general. So I look forward to reading the future drafts of the paper. And again, I thank both Casper and Hao for giving me the opportunity to read and think about the paper. Thank you.
Thanks, Lakshmi. How do you want a 1-minute reply?
Yeah, sure. Very quickly. So thank you very much, Lakshmi, and many of your comments are well taken. Just want to very quickly comment on a few things. First, in the paper, we do focus on the upstream scope 3. Probably that was not super clear in the paper. But I agree with you that maybe we can look at the disclosed part rather than estimated part, which is done in a black box by true cost, that we are not quite aware of their model. I also agree that it's very hard to disentangle emission outsourcing and production outsourcing. So I think they almost go hand in hand. So I think several of our tests, including the demand shocks, try to disentangle these two a little bit, because they are not shocks to production, it's more shocks to incentive. And also our final test on green innovation may also speak to this, right? So they actually have less green innovations. So I apologize. I think the version that we sent to you still have some shocks that I didn't present, precisely because over the last few days we discussed and we feel not all the shocks are good shocks, and so that's why I only presented the demand shock. Yeah, so the other points are very well taken. We will think about how to incorporate them in the next version. Yes.
Great. Thanks, Hao. So let's open up the floor for questions and discussion. So I'll just abuse my role here and ask the first question. Hao, so I think sort of this point of disentangling economic reasons for outsourcing versus outsourcing pollution is super important. And so I don't know whether you have any results on like the total emissions of the firm. So part of it, I think, is sort of, I think that this mitigating effect, that's interesting. But from a policy perspective, what we would like to understand is whether outsourcing creates pollution. So in other words, are we, like, for efficiency gains, moving production to a foreign entity that then are less effective in combating pollution, right? Yeah. Do you have any results along that line?
So I think this is a very good point, and we were also discussing among our co-author team in terms of actually now looking at the ratio of scope 1, scope 3 over the total emission. But I think your question can be divided into two parts. One is total emission by the firm. The second is total emission globally, right? I think some of the anecdotal evidence, for example, the chart I show you about UK total emission seems to indicate, being one of the most advanced economies in the world, also in terms of environmental protection, you look at the trend of UK, there's still an upward trend. So it seems that at the aggregate level, if we believe US, we see similar trend, EU, we see similar trend, emerging economies, they are the ones who emit definitely much more because of the outsourcing. Then I think we can probably infer based on anecdotal evidence that we are actually emitting more rather than less. Whether this can translate into firm level total emission, this will be something that we further look into. Currently, I don't have a good answer, but this is a very good suggestion.
Great. So we had Johan, you had a question early on in the chat box, so we'll go to you first.
Okay, so I actually have two questions. One is in the chat box. This is thinking about the state level legislative pressure. I think Lakshmi already touched on this regarding how should we think about this legislative pressure. Lakshmi think of it from the lobbying perspective. I think of it more from the increased demand for cleaner air from the local population. So if this is like not in my backyard type of argument, then are we saying that the domestic or local politics have an outsized effect on global emission? Or are you saying something different? Like if that's what you're saying, I think you need to go ahead and say it, because from my perspective, I think this basically says that it's not just the institutional investors or the customers, but also just the local stakeholders actually play a role as well in terms of determining what's driving global emission. So that's one. I don't know if it's a question or just a note. The second is actually a note. So I have a paper looking at sort of within firm variation in not emission, not CO2 emission, but looking at the toxic gas emission. And what we found is that firms seem to have a positive correlation between across different plant location. So I think what you're documenting is sort of like negative correlation outside the firm. What we are finding is actually positive correlation within the firm. So I think this is consistent in some ways, because things that you cannot do within the firm, you can sort of outsource it and do it outside. So I'll send you the paper, but I know you may have seen an old version of it before.
Thank you, Johan. Let me very quickly respond. I think also related to what you put in the chat box, I do agree that local stakeholders, they play an important role. We think about some stakeholders, including government as customers, corporate customers, and institutional investors in our test that I didn't have time to fully present, so just in bullet points. But I agree that legislators, as another important stakeholder, may play a role. So it's about how we, phrase this. And relating back to Lakshmi's earlier point, and also you mentioned that this may be driven by local demand. So this may not be exactly exogenous in some sense, but I think what we focus on is, the more like the time series dimension, right? So, suddenly there's an increase, and we actually read some of the documents about why certain states, they have more votes. That's really related to, some Congress members, they were replaced, and they were replaced with people with different mentality. So that is relatively exogenous along time series, although maybe cross-sectionally, we know that California or some other states may be more environmentally conscious. So our identification more come from the time series rather than the cross-section. And also thanks for mentioning your paper. I roughly remember that you sent me some paper for comments earlier on. So you talk about the positive correlation within the firm across different facilities. And actually that is related to the positive correlation we find between scope 1 and the scope 3. So, but the negative effect comes when we take import into consideration. But then if we just think about customer and suppliers, even these are across firms, we see a positive correlation, which may be in line with what you try to argue in your paper. But thanks for that. We will look deeper into that.
Good. Question from the floor? Angie?
Hi, Liang. Now I have a question on how do true cost measure the pollution from the foreign subsidiaries of the company. Do they take that into account? I mean, I'm just wondering whether would it be impacted by how firms actually structure their manufacturing, in the sense that some firms may source from third-party entities, whereas some firms may actually have production in different countries, and then how would that actually impact your results depending on how true cost measures it? And also because Panjiva also, I mean, the import itself, do you take into account subsidiaries of the foreign subsidiaries of the company versus third parties imports?
Okay, thanks, Angie. A very good question. Short answer. So if it's a emission from operation in a firm's overseas subsidiary, this is considered as scope 1 instead of scope 3. So scope 3 are the emissions from other firms. So imports is also thinking about the trade between two firms rather than within the same business group. So what we try to capture is not the emission outsourced to foreign subsidiaries. I think the word outsourcing basically refers to letting others to emit rather than letting a firm's own foreign subsidiary to emit. But I think that's a very interesting scope. We were actually debating among our core team, whether we should think about foreign subsidiary or whether we just totally consider suppliers, so some other firms. I think this is an important issue. I don't have a direct answer now whether we should or should not consider subsidiaries, but at least from the suppliers part, I think the pattern seems to be quite clear.
Good. Other questions from the floor? So maybe I have a yes.
My question probably was related to something that Lakshmi was mentioning as well, that can you look at the output that the firms are producing in the foreign countries? Because I'm just wondering that this can be a blessing in disguise for the smaller underdeveloped countries, right? That they're receiving more output to be outsourced in those countries. So pollution is probably a small byproduct of it. But what happens is that it is ending up being a welfare improving thing in terms of there's more employment, more investments that are coming up over there. So would you be able to shed some light on that area?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think, very often whenever I present a paper related to ESG sustainability, I always got this big question, what's the welfare implication for the whole society? I think that's too much burden on me, but I agree this is a very important point, right? So I think treating off emission with social issues, right? So more employment in overseas markets. I think that's very hard to answer just from this paper. And I think it's also very hard to aggregate because emission and employment, they have different units. Unless I think some of the research are moving into this direction to monetize different environmental and social externalities, positive versus negative. So I think until a time that we can actually quantify and monetize those different impacts, probably we can better answer this question. So we can directly compare monetized employment benefits versus monetized environmental costs, and then we know on the net whether this is welfare improving or not. I think at this moment we still don't have the skill set, not only with this author team, but probably around the globe we don't have this a good methodology to monetize.
Okay, I'm gonna ask the final question before we take a break. How did you do any decomposition of your results? I mean, so part of this is that there is a pollution related to transportation. Mm-hmm. And then obviously you have the actual production of inputs versus raw materials. Do you have any sort of take on how big of effect is transportation in sort of outsourcing pollution here?
Not yet. So I think this is something that we can definitely further look into, and maybe not related to this paper, but just a few weeks ago there was a blockage at the Suez Canal, and I think that really tells us a lot about the importance of shipments, and maybe along the line thinking about pollution along transportation. I think that would be a very interesting question that we can. I will see how deep we can go into the data.
Great. Yeah. So I think we're at the end of the first the paper here, so we should take a break, and then we'll come back in 14 minutes, so 15:15 the hour, and then we'll discuss present and discuss the second paper of the session. So take a break, get some coffee and tea. You have to make it yourself, but we will come back in 15 minutes.